One of the ways that we teach history at Great Hearts is through the individual story of a narrative of individual people. So I'd like to focus on that a little bit. How do we teach controversial figures? For example, how do we teach Robert E. Lee? How do we portray his story appropriately and truthfully without lionizing or demonizing him?
Well, I think that this question relates to some other questions about how do we teach about the American founders, for example, and these figures in history. And I think that the first part of the answer for me is that we always have to be careful about teaching what I call the Mount Rushmore version of history, which is where we just pick out these individuals who we then sort of take out of their context and either, as you said, sort of lionize or demonize, right? We think they're gods or they're demons. And when in matter of fact, of course, the history is always more complicated than just being moved by one individual, right? And so I think we're taken away with these individual stories in a way that teachers should ensure to counter in students, that these people are part of a context and a history that was bigger than them, and that they were people who might have had virtues and vices and positives and negatives, did good things, also did bad things. I think that that's important. And part of that is putting students in the context of the history, that these were people at the time. They weren't figures on Mount Rushmore. And in the case of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate leaders in particular, I do think that it's important for students to understand what the Civil War was about and the fact that this was an unjust war that these people were leading and taking part in. And it's important to understand that and to contextualize it appropriately. That Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals, they were fighting against the United States for an unjust cause. And it's difficult for some people to think of it that way because it's a civil war, right? These were people that were part of the same nation. But I do think that it's similar in many ways to foreign enemies and to leaders of foreign militaries that we fought against in the past, that they're people, they're human beings, they were human beings, but at the same time they were engaged in unjust warfare against our country, and that's a very seriously bad thing. There may also be a distinction to be made between leaders in that conflict, like Robert E. Lee, and ordinary on-the-ground soldiers, right? The hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers who died. And to say that for someone like Robert E. Lee, it's more of a conscious decision to fight for a cause and against the Union than it was perhaps for some Confederate soldiers who were brought into the conflict because of their families, defending their families or their land or however they thought about it themselves, who maybe weren't slaveholders themselves and had no connection to the institution. So I think there's a difference there between the leaders and the ordinary participants as well.
Yes, the fact is that Robert E. Lee was head of the Confederate Army and had some, he was also a father, a husband, he's a human being, for sure. As Adam said, an unjust cause from my perspective. And I think from any reasonable human being would agree that slavery is not a good thing at all. Enslavement by one human being over another is there's nothing right about that. So I really agree with the idea of bringing nuance to these figures in American history, bringing nuance to understand what they were fighting for, what they stood for, and so on. I would say also on the other side, on the Union side too, the founders, right, were, some of them owned slaves themselves, and we need to factor that in too when we talk about these quote unquote great men. And I would also mention here, Tammy, that we need to remind ourselves that those Rushmore figures, there's no woman up there, right? So who are the other great names that we should be adding to our list of iconic Americans, whether it's Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, who are the women that have had great input in the evolution of the society. We should include that as well. So I think the question is a great question for considering leaders of the civil rights movement. It's a great question for considering leaders of feminism. You know, where have they fallen short, and what have they contributed to the progress of the society?
So I'd like to circle back to some of our founders and talk about Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, who actually owned enslaved people.
This comes back to something that we said with Robert E. Lee, right? Which is that we need to draw out the threads of nuance for these human beings, right? They were human beings, complicated human beings like all of us are, that evolve and change and have thoughts and revelations and so on. But I think every time we come back to Thomas Jefferson and the fact that he owned slaves, we sometimes will hear folks say, well, he was a man of his time, everybody else was a slave owner, therefore we should excuse him for that. And I hear that a lot. However, when you go to the Notes on the State of Virginia, which he wrote, so these are his thoughts and his words. Even though he was a person of his time, he did put his thoughts down on what he thought of Black people. And it is damning evidence of this founding father. We include it in our curriculum because we think it's important to, again, get the full picture of these complicated icons in American history. But every time we get to the Notes on the State of Virginia, we have to stop and have long conversations about Thomas Jefferson and these terrible things he says about Black people. He compares them to animals, there are many things. He talks about, their skin and their physique and the fact that they're not very intelligent. They certainly don't have the intelligence to write poetry. So he's doubting Phyllis Wheatley in this book that he publishes. He's doubting her intellect, as well as the intellect of all Black people. He is considering where they should go when they're freed. Certainly they could be freed, but they shouldn't stay here and mix with us. They should be taken out and taken somewhere else. He refers to Black men as being sort of these pathological sexual beings who, it's problematic in so many ways. It's often very difficult to get through the Notes on the State of Virginia. But this is part of who Thomas Jefferson was. I don't think that we should dismiss that.
That's right. And we also teach the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson is acknowledged by most people to be the author of the Declaration of Independence. He put it on his tombstone. But when I teach the Declaration of Independence, I actually, largely for the reasons that Stephanie just mentioned, I like to emphasize the fact that the Declaration of Independence was authored officially by the Second Continental Congress and not by Thomas Jefferson, that he authored a draft of the Declaration of Independence, which was then revised and adopted by the Continental Congress. And actually in that draft, Jefferson has this long paragraph condemning the cruel horrors of slavery. And it's very difficult to reconcile the terrible things that Jefferson did in his life as an enslaver, and the terrible things he wrote in the Notes on the State of Virginia, his reflections on racial hierarchy and difference. It's hard to reconcile that with his apparently vehement condemnation of the immorality of slavery in his draft of the Declaration of Independence. So he was a very conflicted, certainly, figure in those ways. And I think that Jefferson, in his example, highlights for us the tremendous distance and gap between the ideals that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents and the reality of racism and racist enslavement at the time. And I think that we don't even have to try immediately to encompass that with our minds, but more so to just really understand both sides of that gap and both poles of that tension, and to reflect on that. I think that is a useful thing to do, and to not de-emphasize the one or the other. Don't allow the importance of American founding principles to overshadow the enormity of the evils of enslavement. But also, I think as well, don't allow the enormity of the evils of enslavement to deny the truth of human dignity that is expressed in the Declaration of Independence. So I think that's important. And Jefferson himself, in many ways, embodies that tension.
And I think that tension is difficult for us. It has always been difficult. I know when the book that exposed Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and the ways in which he had a African-American woman who was enslaved, who was very young. That the way that historians reacted to that book is a great example of the tension, that we want to see him and think of him as in only one way. And when we are confronted with other truths about who Thomas Jefferson was, we want to preserve the first picture. And that's the first picture is never the only picture of any of us, right? I'm sure that we can pull up some interesting pictures of Adam or myself, right? And all of those pictures are true, you know. And so this is the tension that we deal with in bringing Thomas Jefferson in all his pictures to the table. Robert E. Lee in all his pictures to the table. John Brown, you know. I mean, all these names in American history. Martin Luther King, right, in all his pictures, not just the monument, but also everything we now know about Martin Luther King, the people that were Bayard Rustin, you know, like all these people that he was surrounded by, that give us a fuller, truer picture. The tensions are there. We don't like those tensions, but we have to get in there as academics and help our students parse them out.